Have you ever found something that made you question everything you thought you knew about the world? Something so strange that your mind struggles to accept what your eyes are seeing? Before we begin this story, I need to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop a comment and tell me your location. I love knowing where our listeners are, especially when we're about to dive into something as unsettling as what happened in the Cumberland Plateau in the year 1898. This is a story about a man who made a discovery that should have stayed buried in those ancient mountains, and what happened when he brought pieces of it back to civilization. The year was 1898, and Vernon Ashcroft was 37 years old, a hunter and fur trader who worked the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and weathered, like the hickory trees that dotted the ridgelines he called home. His hands were scarred from decades of skinning and tanning, and his left eye had a peculiar way of not quite focusing, the result of a close encounter with a wounded black bear when he was 23. Vernon had spent his entire adult life in those mountains, learning their secrets the way other men learned to read books, and he prided himself on knowing every hollow, every creek, every game trail within 50 miles of his cabin near a settlement called Harlan Station. Vernon lived alone in a cabin he'd built himself about 7 miles from the nearest neighbor, a distance he preferred because it meant the game was plentiful and the solitude complete. His only regular companion was a mixed-breed dog named Striker, mostly hound with something else mixed in that gave him unusual intelligence and an uncanny ability to track wounded animals through terrain that would confound most hunting dogs. Vernon made his living selling furs and occasionally guiding wealthy men from Lexington or Louisville who wanted to hunt elk in the high country, though those jobs were becoming scarce as the animals grew fewer each year. He supplemented his income by collecting ginseng root, which he sold to a Chinese merchant who came through Harlan Station twice a year, and by trapping during the winter months when the pelts were thickest. It was late October when Vernon first heard about the skulls from a man named Josiah Pendergast, a peddler who traveled the mountain communities selling everything from needles to patent medicines. Josiah was in his early 50s, a short man with a pronounced limp from a childhood injury and a talent for collecting gossip the way Vernon collected furs. He arrived at Vernon's cabin on a gray afternoon when the wind carried the smell of coming snow, his wagon creaking under the weight of his wares and his stories. Josiah told Vernon about a farmer named Silas Cornett, who lived in a remote valley about 20 miles southeast, near the Virginia border. Silas had recently cleared some land for planting and had uncovered something peculiar while moving rocks from a hillside. According to Josiah, Silas had found several skulls buried in the rocky soil, skulls unlike anything anyone in those parts had ever seen before. The story might have ended there, just another piece of mountain gossip, except that Silas had supposedly taken one of the skulls to a doctor in Middlesboro, and the doctor had offered him $50 for it on the spot. $50 was more than most farmers in those mountains made in half a year, and Silas had refused the offer, sensing that if the skull was worth that much to the doctor, it might be worth even more to someone else. Vernon listened to this story with the skepticism of a man who had heard tall tales all his life. But something about it caught his attention. $50 was serious money, and doctors didn't offer that kind of sum for ordinary curiosities. He asked Josiah what made these skulls so unusual, and the peddler leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, even though they were alone except for Striker, who dozed by the fire. Josiah said the skulls weren't from any animal anyone could identify, not bear, not elk, not even the panthers that still occasionally prowled the highest ridges. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw structure too strange, the cranial capacity too big for anything that should exist in those mountains. Silas had reportedly shown the skull to several old-timers who'd spent their entire lives in the region, and not one of them could say what creature it had belonged to. Vernon asked Josiah if he'd seen the skull himself, and the peddler admitted he hadn't. He'd only heard the story from Silas's brother-in-law, who'd been present when the doctor made his offer. But Josiah had known Silas for years, and he swore the man wasn't given to exaggeration or fantasy. If Silas said he'd found strange skulls, then strange skulls had been found. The peddler mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Silas had told his brother-in-law there were more skulls still in the ground where he'd found the first ones, dozens of them perhaps, all buried together in what looked like some kind of mass grave or burial site. After Josiah left the next morning, Vernon couldn't stop thinking about those skulls. He tried to focus on his work, checking his trap lines and repairing the roof of his smokehouse before winter set in. But his mind kept returning to what the peddler had told him, $50 for a single skull. If there were dozens more, and if he could find them before Silas decided to excavate them himself, or word spread to others who might try their luck, Vernon could make enough money to finally buy that bottomland he'd been eyeing near the Clover Fork, maybe even enough to stock it with cattle and start building something more permanent than his current hand-to-mouth existence. He spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. Part of him recognized that digging up strange bones from a burial site felt wrong somehow, like disturbing something that had been deliberately hidden. But another part of him, the practical part that had learned to survive in these unforgiving mountains, reasoned that bones were just bones, and if some city doctor wanted to pay good money for them, who was Vernon to question the transaction? He'd killed and skinned hundreds of animals in his life, sold their pelts without a second thought. How was this different? On the 4th day, Vernon packed supplies for a week-long trip, loaded his rifle and his tools onto his mule, and set out southeast with Stryker trotting ahead. He'd managed to get better directions from a neighbor who knew Silas Cornett's farm, though the neighbor warned him that Silas wasn't likely to appreciate visitors poking around his land, especially visitors interested in those skulls he'd found. Vernon decided he'd approach Silas honestly, maybe offer to partner with him on excavating and selling the rest of the skulls, split the profits fairly. That seemed the right way to handle it. The journey took 2 full days through increasingly rough terrain. Vernon followed game trails and old logging roads, camping the first night in a sheltered hollow where a spring provided fresh water. The weather held clear but cold, the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the mountains show their colors in brilliant displays of red and gold. On the 2nd afternoon, he reached the general area where Silas's farm was supposed to be, but finding the exact location proved more difficult than he'd anticipated. The valleys in that region all looked similar, and the sparse population meant there were few landmarks to navigate by. Vernon was beginning to think he'd have to backtrack and ask for better directions when Stryker suddenly stopped on the trail ahead, his body going rigid in that particular way that meant he'd scented something unusual. Vernon approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. But what Stryker had found wasn't game or predator. It was a marker of sorts, a cairn of stacked stones beside the trail with what looked like a piece of cloth tied to a stick planted among the rocks. The cloth was faded and weathered, but Vernon could make out what might have been symbols or letters painted on it at some point, too worn now to read clearly. He studied the marker for several minutes, uncertain what it meant. Trail markers weren't uncommon in the mountains, but they usually indicated property boundaries or the location of springs. This one felt different somehow, more like a warning than a waypoint. Stryker circled the cairn nervously, whining low in his throat, which was unusual behavior for the normally fearless dog. Vernon was about to move on when he noticed something else. There were more cairns visible further up the trail, spaced at irregular intervals, all decorated with similar weathered cloth markers. Following the cairns led Vernon off the main trail and into a narrow valley he hadn't known existed. The valley ran roughly north to south, hemmed in by steep ridges on both sides, with a small creek meandering down its center. The trees here were old growth, massive oaks and chestnuts that must have escaped the loggers' saws, their canopy so thick that the forest floor lay in perpetual shadow, even in mid-afternoon. Vernon noticed that the underbrush was surprisingly sparse, giving the place an oddly manicured appearance, as if someone had cleared away the smaller plants and saplings deliberately. About half a mile into the valley, Vernon found what remained of Silas Cornett's farm. I say remained because it was clear that no one had lived there for some time. The cabin stood in a clearing beside the creek, its walls intact but its door hanging open on broken hinges. The windows were empty of glass, and several of the roof shingles had blown away, leaving gaps that would let in rain. A barn or storage shed had partially collapsed, its timbers rotting and covered in vines. What had once been a kitchen garden was now overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees. The whole place had the abandoned, melancholy air of a homestead reclaimed by the forest. Vernon called out several times, but only his echo answered back. He dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously, Stryker pressed close to his leg in a way that suggested the dog was deeply uneasy. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a few pieces of broken furniture and some rusted tools. There was evidence that animals had been using it as a den. Raccoons scat in one corner, bird nests in the rafters, but what struck Vernon most forcefully was the walls. They were covered in writing. Not everywhere, but in certain spots, especially around the door and windows. Someone had used what looked like charcoal or burnt wood to write directly on the log walls, filling every available surface with cramped, frantic handwriting. Vernon couldn't read most of it. The light was too dim, and the writing too small and disorganized. But he could make out certain phrases that repeated, "They were already here. The ground remembers, not animal, counting wrong. They watch when we sleep." He stood there for a long moment, reading what he could, trying to make sense of it. The writing had the quality of someone trying to document something important, or trying to convince themselves of something, the same sentence repeated over and over in places, as if the writer was working through an idea or fighting against a thought they didn't want to accept. Vernon had seen men lose their minds in these mountains before. The isolation could do that, especially to people who weren't born to it. He assumed that Silas Cornett had suffered some kind of breakdown, abandoned his farm, and was probably living with relatives somewhere or had moved to town. But that didn't explain the skulls or why a doctor would offer $50 for one. Vernon left the cabin and began searching the clearing and the surrounding forest. If Silas had found the skulls while clearing land, there should be evidence of excavation somewhere nearby. It took him nearly an hour of searching before he found it, an area about 200 yards from the cabin on a slight rise above the creek where someone had clearly been digging. The site was larger than Vernon had expected, maybe 30 feet across with several pits of varying depths. Most had been filled in again, either deliberately or by erosion, but one remained partially open. Vernon approached the open pit carefully. It was roughly circular, about 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep. The walls showed clear evidence of having been dug by hand, the tool marks still visible in the clay soil. At the bottom of the pit, partially exposed, Vernon could see what had drawn him here, bones. Not just one or two, but many, jumbled together in what did indeed look like some kind of mass burial. And among the bones, even from where he stood, Vernon could see the distinctive curve of skulls. He'd brought a shovel and a pick, thinking he might need them. Now he climbed down into the pit and began carefully clearing away the soil from around the bones. The work was slow and painstaking. Vernon had no training in excavation or archaeology, but he had enough sense to realize that these remains were old, very old, and might be fragile. He worked as the afternoon light began to fade, finally extracting his first complete skull just as the sun touched the western ridge. What he held in his hands made him understand immediately why a doctor would pay $50. The skull was roughly the size of a large dog's, maybe slightly bigger, but its structure was like nothing Vernon had ever encountered. The cranium was elongated in a way that seemed wrong, the eye sockets positioned too far forward, and angled in a manner that suggested binocular vision like a predator, but larger and more prominent than any predator skull he'd seen. The jaw was heavy, built for powerful biting, with teeth that were still partially embedded in the bone. But it was the overall shape that disturbed him most. It suggested intelligence somehow, a brain cavity that seemed too large, too developed for a mere animal. Vernon sat on the edge of the pit as darkness gathered, turning the skull over in his hands, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew of the natural world. He'd hunted and trapped for 20 years. He'd seen bear skulls and wolf skulls, panther skulls and elk skulls, skulls from every creature that called these mountains home. This was none of those things. The proportions were wrong. The whole structure was wrong. If he'd found it alone, he might have dismissed it as some kind of deformity or mutation, but the pit was full of similar skulls, dozens of them from what he could see, all with the same unsettling characteristics. And, speaking of which, have you ever found something that science couldn't quite explain? Something that made you question what you thought was real? Drop a comment and tell me about it. I want to know what strange discoveries you've encountered. Vernon made camp near the dig site that night, building a fire and trying to convince himself that what he'd found was valuable rather than disturbing. He laid out the skull beside his bedroll, studying it by firelight, attempting to imagine what kind of creature it had belonged to. The bone was mineralized, petrified almost, which suggested great age. How long would bones need to be buried to turn to stone like this? Hundreds of years? Thousands? He had no idea, but it reinforced his sense that these remains were ancient, from a time before written history, maybe even before human settlement in these mountains. Stryker refused to sleep near the skull. The dog circled Vernon's camp repeatedly, whining and pacing, until Vernon finally lost patience and threw a stick at him, ordering him to settle. But even then, Stryker kept his distance, lying just beyond the firelight, with his eyes fixed on the skull, a low growl rumbling periodically in his chest. Vernon slept poorly that night, troubled by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He rose before dawn, stiff and cold, and resumed his excavation as soon as there was enough light to see. Over the next 3 days, he extracted 17 more skulls from the pit, along with numerous other bones that he couldn't easily identify. Some were clearly leg bones or ribs, but others had unusual structures or joints that didn't match his limited anatomical knowledge. He packed the skulls carefully in canvas sacks, padded with moss and leaves, treating them like the valuable commodities he hoped they would become. On the 4th day, Vernon decided he had enough. 18 skulls should be more than sufficient to make his fortune, if he could find the right buyers. He'd noticed that the deeper he dug, the more disturbed Stryker became, until the dog was spending most of his time on the far side of the clearing, refusing to come near the pit at all. Vernon himself had begun experiencing odd sensations while working, moments of profound unease that would wash over him without apparent cause, a feeling of being watched that persisted even when he could see clearly that he was alone, and a strange ringing in his ears that came and went without pattern. He told himself these were just the effects of isolation and exhaustion, the natural result of several days of hard physical labor in a lonely valley. But part of him recognized that something about this place felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. It wasn't just the abandoned farm or the strange writing in the cabin or even the inexplicable skulls. It was something in the air itself, a quality of wrongness that seemed to intensify the longer he stayed. Vernon loaded his mule with the sacks of skulls and prepared to leave. Before departing, He walked back to the cabin one more time, drawn by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. In the growing morning light, he could see the wall writing more clearly now, and he spent several minutes reading the frantic scrawls, trying to piece together what had happened to Silas Cornett. One passage, written in larger letters near the door, caught his attention. Found them April 19th. Started digging April 22nd. First dream April 23rd. They are not pleased we disturbed them. They show me things when I close my eyes, things that were here before, things that might come back. The ground remembers even if we have forgotten. We were never alone in these mountains. Vernon copied this passage into his own notebook, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to preserve it. Then he left the valley, following the cairns back to the main trail, eager to put distance between himself and that unsettling place. Stryker trotted ahead with obvious relief, no longer displaying the nervous behavior that had characterized the past several days. The journey back to Harlan Station took 3 days. Vernon traveled cautiously, acutely aware that he was carrying something valuable and potentially fragile. He'd wrapped each skull individually and packed them with as much padding as he could manage. But the mountain trails were rough, and several times he had to dismount and lead his mule through particularly treacherous sections to avoid jarring the cargo. During this return journey, Vernon began to notice something odd. His dreams, which had always been fragmentary and forgettable, had taken on a vivid, almost hallucinatory quality. He would dream of the valley where he'd found the skulls, but the valley as it had been in some impossibly distant past. In these dreams, the forest was different, the trees smaller and more widely spaced. And there were. Vernon struggled to find the right word. Beings there. Creatures that moved through the shadows on 4 legs, but with a gait that seemed too purposeful, too coordinated to be merely animal. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing and a lingering sense that he'd been shown something he wasn't meant to see. He tried to dismiss the dreams as a product of exhaustion and the stress of his expedition, but they continued nightly, growing more detailed and more disturbing. In one particularly vivid dream, he stood in the middle of the valley at night, and the beings he'd glimpsed before emerged from the tree line in dozens, maybe hundreds, surrounding him in a vast circle. They didn't approach or threaten, just watched with eyes that reflected moonlight like a cat's, but with something else behind that reflection, some quality of intelligence or awareness that made his blood run cold even in sleep. Vernon reached Harlan Station on an overcast afternoon in early November. The town was small even by mountain standards, barely 36 buildings clustered around a muddy main street. But it had a telegraph office and a railway depot, which made it the commercial center for miles around. Vernon's first stop was the general store, where he purchased supplies and tried to make casual inquiries about who might be interested in unusual animal specimens. The storekeeper, a man named Rufus Kilgore, who Vernon had known for years, suggested he contact a professor at a college in Lexington who sometimes bought fossils and native artifacts. Vernon sent a telegram from the railway office that same afternoon, carefully wording his message to suggest he had discovered significant paleontological specimens without being too specific about their nature or number. He signed his name and the name of the town, then waited. Telegrams were expensive, but Vernon reasoned that if these skulls were worth what he hoped, the cost would be trivial by comparison. The telegraph operator, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, asked Vernon what kind of specimens he'd found, but Vernon deflected the question, saying only that they were fossils of an unknown species. While waiting for a reply, Vernon took a room at the town's only boarding house, a 2-story structure run by a widow named Cora Sykes. The room was small but clean, with a real mattress and a window overlooking the street. Vernon stored his sacks of skulls under the bed, checking them periodically to ensure they remained undisturbed. That first night in town, he slept better than he had in days, dreamless and deep, and woke feeling more like himself than he had since leaving the valley. The reply to his telegram came 3 days later. Professor Augustus Whitfield of Central University in Lexington expressed strong interest in Vernon's discovery and indicated he would travel to Harlan Station personally to examine the specimens. He provided a date for his arrival, approximately 1 week hence, and asked Vernon to keep the discovery confidential until they could meet. Vernon read the telegram multiple times, hardly daring to believe his luck. A professor traveling all the way from Lexington meant the skulls were indeed valuable, perhaps even more valuable than he'd imagined. During the week while waiting for Professor Whitfield, Vernon made the mistake of sharing his good fortune with several people in town. He didn't reveal details about what he'd found, but he mentioned to Rufus Kilgore and a few others that he'd made a significant discovery that might bring him considerable money. In a small town where most people knew everyone else's business, this kind of news traveled quickly. Within 2 days, Vernon noticed he'd become the subject of considerable attention and speculation. People who'd barely acknowledged him before suddenly wanted to buy him drinks or engage him in conversation, trying to pry loose details about his find. One evening, Vernon was approached in the boarding house dining room by a man he'd never seen before. The stranger was well-dressed by mountain standards, wearing a suit that had seen better days but still conveyed a sense of professional respectability. He introduced himself as Hadley Morse, a representative for a museum in Cincinnati. Morse said he'd heard through certain channels that Vernon had made an interesting paleontological discovery, and his institution would be very interested in acquiring any significant specimens. He suggested they step outside to discuss terms privately. Vernon's instincts told him something was off about Morse. The man's story was plausible enough, but there was something in his manner, a certain eagerness barely concealed beneath professional courtesy, that made Vernon wary. He told Morse politely but firmly that he'd already made arrangements to show his specimens to a professor from Lexington, and he wouldn't consider other offers until after that meeting. Morse's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation before smoothing back into professional neutrality. He handed Vernon a calling card and urged him to get in touch if his current arrangement fell through, then left without further conversation. Vernon mentioned the encounter to Cora Sykes later that evening, and the widow's reaction surprised him. She became visibly agitated, warning Vernon that there had been other men like Morse passing through town recently, strangers asking questions about fossils and old bones, offering money for information. Cora said she'd gotten a bad feeling about the whole business, that it reminded her of when the lumber companies had first come through, offering local people pennies for timber rights that were worth fortunes. She urged Vernon to be careful about who he trusted. That night, Vernon's dreams returned. He was back in the valley, standing at the edge of the pit where he'd excavated the skulls. But in the dream, the pit was much larger, deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom, and something was climbing out of it, slowly, deliberately, hauling itself up from the darkness using limbs that bent in ways that made his eyes hurt to follow. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He could only stand there, frozen, as the thing climbed closer, close enough that he could hear the scrape of its claws on stone, the rasp of its breathing, close enough that he could almost see its face. And then he woke, gasping, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the November chill. Vernon got out of bed and lit the lamp, needing light and movement to shake off the nightmare's grip. He pulled out one of the skulls from under the bed, examining it in the lamplight, as if seeing it clearly might dispel some of the dream's power. The bone felt cold in his hands, colder than the ambient temperature would explain. As he turned it, studying the eye sockets and the strange configuration of the jaw, he found himself wondering what these creatures had been, really? Not just anatomically, but existentially. Had they been predators? Had they hunted in packs? Had they been intelligent in any meaningful sense? And, perhaps most disturbingly, what had killed them all and buried them together in that valley? Professor Whitfield arrived on schedule, stepping off the train on a gray afternoon with the look of a man unaccustomed to travel in rural areas. He was in his early 60s, Vernon guessed, tall and slightly stooped, with wild gray hair and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He wore a city suit that looked absurdly formal against the backdrop of Harlan Station's muddy streets, and he carried a leather satchel that appeared heavy with books or papers. Vernon met him at the station and helped arrange transport of his luggage to the boarding house. Over supper that evening, Whitfield explained his background and credentials. He was a professor of natural history with a particular interest in paleontology, especially fossil mammals of the Tertiary period. He'd published papers in several scientific journals and had corresponded with leading researchers in Europe and America. He spoke with the careful precision of an academic, choosing his words deliberately, occasionally pausing mid-sentence to clarify or refine a point. Vernon found himself liking the man despite his initial skepticism about city folk. After the meal, Vernon invited Whitfield to his room to examine the specimens. He'd laid out 6 of the skulls on a sheet spread across the floor, selecting what he considered the best preserved examples. Whitfield's reaction upon seeing them was immediate and profound. He knelt beside the skulls, his professional composure cracking to reveal genuine astonishment. He picked up the nearest one with hands that shook slightly, turning it in the lamplight, examining every detail with an intensity that was almost reverent. For several minutes, Whitfield said nothing at all. He simply studied the skulls one after another, occasionally pulling a magnifying glass from his satchel to inspect particular features more closely. Vernon watched this examination with growing confidence. Whatever these skulls were, they were clearly significant enough to reduce a learned professor to stunned silence. Finally, Whitfield looked up at Vernon with an expression that mixed excitement with something that might have been fear. The professor's first question was about the excavation site. He wanted to know everything: exact location, depth of burial, associated materials, stratigraphic context, soil composition. Vernon did his best to answer, though he had to admit his lack of scientific method in extracting the specimens. Whitfield winced at Vernon's description of his excavation technique, but seemed to recognize that a rough frontiersman couldn't be expected to follow archaeological protocols. What mattered was the specimens themselves, and they were extraordinary. Whitfield explained that the skulls resembled nothing in the known fossil record of North American mammals. The cranial capacity suggested intelligence far beyond typical predators. The dental structure indicated a diet that was probably omnivorous, capable of processing both meat and plant material. The eye socket placement suggested excellent binocular vision, but most intriguing was the overall morphology, which suggested a creature that might have been partially arboreal, adapted for both ground movement and climbing. Whitfield estimated the complete animal would have been perhaps 4 to 5 feet long, powerfully built, probably weighing somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds. Vernon asked the obvious question: what were they? Whitfield removed his spectacles and cleaned them, a gesture Vernon would come to recognize as the professor's habit when formulating difficult thoughts. He said honestly that he didn't know. The skulls showed characteristics of several different mammalian lineages without fitting comfortably into any of them. If they were genuine fossils, and preliminary examination suggested they were, then they represented either an unknown branch of mammalian evolution or possibly evidence of convergent evolution producing forms similar to known species, but through independent pathways. Either possibility would be scientifically significant, but then Whitfield added something that made Vernon's sense of triumph falter slightly. The professor said that the skulls troubled him for reasons beyond taxonomy. The mineralization pattern was unusual, suggesting burial in very specific soil conditions. The sheer number of individuals in what Vernon described as a single deposit was unprecedented for any terrestrial mammal he knew of. And there was something about the proportions, the cranial development particularly, that struck him as almost purposeful, as if these creatures had been. And here, Whitfield hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of his own thoughts, as if these creatures had been developing towards something. Vernon didn't fully understand what the professor meant by that last comment, but he didn't press for clarification. Instead, he asked about value. What would institutions pay for these specimens? Whitfield's answer was both encouraging and complicated. The skulls themselves were priceless from a scientific standpoint, each one a unique window into an unknown chapter of natural history. But the commercial value depended on several factors: provenance, verification, competing claims, and the willingness of institutions to acquire specimens that might prove controversial. He offered Vernon $500 for the 6 skulls currently on display, with the stipulation that Vernon would guide him to the excavation site so they could properly document the find and extract additional specimens using scientific methods. $500 was more money than Vernon had ever possessed at one time, more than he'd make in 5 years of trapping and hunting. He accepted immediately, and they shook hands on the deal. And since we're here, this story is being narrated by The Fear Behind You. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening to this on another channel, you should know they stole our content without permission. Please report it so we can protect our work. The next morning, Vernon and Professor Whitfield made preparations for the journey back to the valley. Whitfield had brought his own tools, proper archaeological implements, including small brushes and marking stakes, and a camera for documentation. Vernon arranged for pack horses and supplies for what they estimated would be a 2-week expedition. Word of their planned trip spread quickly through town, and Vernon noticed that several people seemed unusually interested in their destination. Hadley Morse appeared at the boarding house the evening before their departure, making one final attempt to purchase the specimens, but Whitfield politely declined on Vernon's behalf. They departed Harlan Station on a cold November morning with low clouds promising snow. The journey to the valley took them 3 days, slightly longer than Vernon's original trip, due to Whitfield's inexperience with mountain travel and the need to move carefully with the scientific equipment. During those 3 days of travel, Vernon found himself telling Whitfield about the strange aspects of his discovery: the abandoned farm, the writing on the cabin walls, Silas Cornett's disappearance, the unsettling dreams. Whitfield listened to these details with an expression that grew increasingly thoughtful. He mentioned that other paleontological sites had reported unusual phenomena, though he was careful to frame these as psychological effects rather than supernatural occurrences. The isolation of remote dig sites, combined with long hours of physically demanding work, could produce various mental disturbances. The writing Vernon had described sounded like the product of someone experiencing a dissociative episode or possibly the early stages of a psychotic break. The dreams were likely Vernon's subconscious mind processing the unusual nature of his find. Vernon wanted to believe the professor's rational explanations, but some part of him remembered the feeling of that valley, the sense of wrongness that had permeated everything, and wondered if rationality was sufficient to explain what he'd experienced. They reached the valley on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The weather had turned colder, and a light snow was beginning to fall, dusting the ridgelines with white. Vernon led them past the cairns and into the narrow valley, and even in daylight, even with company, he felt that same creeping unease he'd experienced during his first visit. Whitfield seemed to notice the atmosphere as well, commenting on how quiet the valley was, how few birds they'd seen or heard since entering it. The abandoned farm looked exactly as Vernon had left it. They made camp in the clearing near the cabin, Whitfield insisting on examining the structure before darkness fell. Vernon watched as the professor studied the wall writing, copying passages into his notebook with the meticulous care of a scholar documenting primary sources. Whitfield's expression as he read was difficult to interpret, somewhere between scientific fascination and genuine disturbance. That evening, as they sat by their campfire eating a simple supper, Whitfield asked Vernon if he'd noticed anything unusual about the cairns they'd passed on the way in. Vernon admitted he'd found them strange, but hadn't given them much thought beyond using them as trail markers. Whitfield said he'd examined several closely during their journey, and what he'd found disturbed him. The stones in each cairn had been deliberately selected and arranged, he believed, not randomly stacked, and the cloth markers, weathered as they were, showed traces of symbols that might be writing, though not in any alphabet Whitfield recognized. The professor's theory was that the cairns were very old, possibly centuries old, and represented some kind of warning or boundary marker. The valley, he suggested, might have been considered taboo or forbidden by earlier inhabitants of the region, possibly native peoples who had lived here before European settlement. The mass burial of the strange creatures Vernon had found could be evidence of some kind of mass death event that had been witnessed and remembered in local traditions, passed down until those traditions eventually faded and were forgotten. Vernon asked if that meant the skulls were relatively recent rather than truly ancient. Whitfield shook his head. The mineralization he'd observed suggested the bones were very old indeed, thousands of years at minimum. But that didn't preclude the possibility that knowledge of their existence had been preserved through oral tradition for generations, or that the burial site itself had been marked and avoided by successive cultures. They began excavation work the following morning. Whitfield's approach was methodical and time-consuming, the opposite of Vernon's rough digging. The professor divided the site into a grid, carefully documenting the position of every find before removing it. He photographed extensively, though the gray weather made this challenging. Vernon assisted as best he could, following Whitfield's instructions, learning the basics of proper excavation technique. Over the next 4 days, they extracted 23 more skulls and several dozen other bones. Whitfield's excitement grew with each discovery, but so did his unease. He began noticing patterns in how the remains were arranged. The skulls weren't randomly jumbled, as might be expected from a natural die-off or predator cache. Instead, they seemed to be positioned deliberately, arranged in what might be concentric circles or spirals, though erosion and time had disturbed the original pattern. Whitfield suggested this indicated intentional burial, possibly ritualistic in nature. But who would have buried them, and why? On the 5th day, they made a discovery that fundamentally changed Whitfield's understanding of what they'd found. While carefully excavating the southeastern section of the site, the professor uncovered something that wasn't bone. It was stone, but clearly worked stone, shaped by tools or hands into a form that was unmistakably artificial. The object was roughly triangular, about the size of Vernon's hand, with edges that had been deliberately sharpened or flaked. It looked, Vernon thought, like some kind of tool or weapon, similar to the arrowheads and stone implements he'd occasionally found in these mountains, artifacts of the indigenous peoples who'd lived here before displacement. Except the size was wrong, the proportions were wrong. This stone tool had clearly been designed for a hand much larger than any human's, with fingers configured differently, the grip suggesting something between human dexterity and animal paw structure. Whitfield sat on the edge of the excavation pit, holding the stone tool and staring at it with an expression Vernon couldn't quite read. After a long silence, the professor spoke quietly, almost as if talking to himself rather than Vernon. He said they needed to consider a possibility that was, from a scientific standpoint, almost inconceivable. What if the creatures they'd found weren't simply unusual mammals? What if they'd been tool users? What if they'd possessed some level of intelligence, enough to create implements and possibly even burial rituals? Vernon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. He thought about the dreams he'd been having, the sense of being watched, the writing on the cabin walls. He asked Whitfield what the implications would be if the creatures had been intelligent. The professor removed his spectacles and cleaned them, that familiar gesture of uncomfortable thought. He said the implications would be profound and troubling. It would mean that humanity hadn't been alone in its evolutionary journey toward intelligence. It would mean that other thinking beings had existed, possibly for thousands or millions of years, and had ultimately failed, died out, left nothing but buried bones and forgotten warnings. But more troubling, Whitfield added, was what might have killed them all. A species intelligent enough to create tools and practice burial rites wouldn't vanish easily. It would adapt, survive, persist. Whatever had wiped them out must have been catastrophic, possibly environmental change or disease, possibly something worse. That night, both Vernon and Whitfield experienced the dreams. They compared notes the next morning over breakfast and found their nighttime visions had been remarkably similar. Both had dreamed of the valley as it had been in some distant past, populated by the creatures whose bones they were excavating. Both had seen these beings moving through the forest with clear purpose and organization, hunting in coordinated groups, using tools, communicating with sounds that were almost but not quite language. And both had seen something else in their dreams, something that remained frustratingly unclear, a presence or force that the creatures feared, that drove them to whatever desperate actions had led to their mass death and burial. Whitfield suggested they halt excavations for a day and instead explore the surrounding valley more thoroughly. Vernon agreed, partly because he was curious about what else they might find, but mostly because he needed a break from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the dig site. They spent that day hiking the ridgelines and following the creek, searching for additional sites or artifacts. What they found was more disturbing than helpful. At multiple locations throughout the valley, they discovered evidence of additional burial sites, smaller than the main pit, but clearly related. Some contained only a few individuals, others a dozen or more. All showed the same careful arrangement, the same deliberate positioning of remains. Whitfield's rough count suggested there might be upwards of 300 individuals buried throughout the valley, possibly more. He asked Vernon a question that had clearly been troubling him. In all Vernon's years hunting these mountains, had he ever seen or heard of creatures matching what these skulls suggested? Living ones, he meant, not fossils. Vernon thought carefully before answering. He'd seen many strange things in the wilderness, encountered animals he couldn't quite identify, heard sounds in the night that defied explanation, but nothing that matched these skulls. Nothing with that peculiar combination of size and apparent intelligence. Whatever these creatures had been, they were gone now, extinct, possibly for thousands of years. Whitfield seemed both relieved and disappointed by this answer. On their 8th day in the valley, something happened that neither man could easily explain or dismiss. They were working at the main excavation site in late afternoon when Stryker, who'd been lying quietly nearby, suddenly stood and began barking frantically toward the tree line. Vernon had never heard the dog make sounds like this, a combination of fear and aggression that raised the hair on his own neck. Both men stopped working and looked in the direction Stryker was facing. The forest was still and quiet, the trees standing in their late autumn nakedness, their branches bare against the gray sky. Vernon could see nothing unusual, no movement, no sign of any animal or person, but Stryker continued barking, his body rigid, his attention fixed on something in the shadows between the trees. Then slowly, deliberately, the dog began backing away, still barking, but clearly unwilling to hold his ground against whatever he perceived. Whitfield asked quietly what Vernon thought was out there. Vernon honestly didn't know. He picked up his rifle and advanced slowly toward the tree line, calling out a warning to any person who might be hiding there, making enough noise to scare away any bear or panther. He reached the edge of the forest and peered into the shadowed interior, his finger ready on the trigger. Nothing. No tracks in the soft earth, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Vernon stood at the forest's edge for several minutes, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that might betray a presence. The silence was absolute, broken only by Stryker's continued agitated barking from behind him. Finally, he returned to the excavation site and told Whitfield they should pack up for the day, head back to camp. The professor didn't argue. That evening, they discussed what had happened. Whitfield tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Stryker had scented a predator, something large enough to make the dog nervous. Mountain lions still prowled these ridges occasionally, and a big cat might make even a brave dog reluctant to engage. But Vernon had hunted mountain lions, and he knew what Stryker's reaction to big cats was. This had been different. The dog hadn't been warning away a predator. He'd been genuinely terrified. Vernon mentioned the feeling of being watched, and Whitfield admitted he'd felt it too. Not just during the incident with Stryker, but intermittently throughout their time in the valley. The professor tried to explain this as a psychological phenomenon, the human tendency to project consciousness onto uncertain situations, our evolutionary heritage making us see predators and threats even where none exist. But his explanation sounded hollow even to himself, and he eventually trailed off into silence. They decided to spend 2 more days excavating, then return to Harlan Station with their specimens. Whitfield said he had more than enough material for several papers, possibly even a monograph. The discovery would make his career, establish his reputation as one of the leading paleontologists in America. But Vernon noticed the professor's enthusiasm had dimmed since their arrival in the valley, replaced by a tension that seemed to grow stronger each day. The final 2 days of excavation passed without major incident, though both men remained on edge, starting at unexpected sounds and frequently checking the tree line for movement. They extracted a few more skulls and several remarkably well-preserved limb bones that Whitfield said would be crucial for understanding how these creatures had moved and lived. On their last evening in the valley, they carefully packed all the specimens, wrapping each in cloth and padding them with moss and pine needles for the journey out. Vernon suggested they burn the cabin before leaving. He couldn't fully explain why, but the idea of that structure standing empty with its mad wall writing seemed wrong somehow, as if it might draw others to this place who were better off staying away. Whitfield initially objected on grounds of preserving historical evidence, but Vernon's practical argument won out. The cabin was already falling apart, and the wall writing would likely be illegible within a few more years regardless. Better to end it cleanly. They soaked the interior with lamp oil and set it ablaze just before dawn on their departure day. The structure burned quickly, the dry wood catching with an almost eager intensity. Vernon and Whitfield stood watching as flames consumed the cabin, and with it, Silas Cornett's frantic documentation of whatever he'd experienced here. As the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, Vernon felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully recognized until it lifted. They left the valley as the sun rose, following the cairns back to the main trail. Neither man looked back. The return journey to Harlan Station took 4 days due to the need to move carefully with their fragile cargo. The weather had turned colder, and they had to navigate several sections of trail that were iced over and treacherous. But the specimens survived the trip intact, and they arrived back in town on a gray afternoon in late November to find that word of their discovery had spread far beyond what Vernon had anticipated. There were 3 more strangers waiting in town, all claiming to represent various museums or universities, all eager to examine and potentially purchase specimens. Whitfield dealt with them politely but firmly, explaining that the specimens were already committed to Central University, pending final evaluation and documentation. One of the strangers, a man who introduced himself as representing the Smithsonian Institution, became quite aggressive when Whitfield refused to even let him view the skulls, threatening legal action and making vague claims about federal jurisdiction over fossil discoveries. Vernon found the whole situation exhausting and vaguely threatening. He'd imagined a simple transaction: trade the skulls for money, use that money to start a better life. Instead, he'd become entangled in what appeared to be fierce competition among scientific institutions, with himself as the unwitting prize. He told Whitfield he just wanted to complete their deal and be done with the whole business. The professor arranged immediate transport of the specimens to Lexington, accompanying them personally on the train to ensure their safety. Before departing, he gave Vernon $250 in cash as a down payment, promising the remainder would be sent once the university had formally accepted and cataloged the specimens. He also made Vernon sign several documents affirming the provenance of the fossils and granting Central University first rights to any additional discoveries from the site. Vernon watched the train carry away Professor Whitfield and the skulls with mixed feelings. Relief, certainly, to be free of the responsibility and the attention they'd attracted, but also a strange sense of loss, as if he'd parted with something that had become, over the past weeks, oddly significant to him. Not the skulls themselves exactly, but what they represented, evidence that the world was stranger and more mysterious than he'd ever imagined. He used some of the money to pay his bill at the boarding house and buy supplies, then rode back to his cabin near the Clover Fork. It felt good to be home, to return to familiar surroundings and simple routines. Stryker seemed equally glad to be back, immediately resuming his normal behavior after weeks of anxiety and strange reactions. Vernon tried to settle back into his old life, checking his trap lines, hunting for winter meat, repairing things around his property that needed attention. But the dreams continued. Not every night, but often enough that Vernon came to dread sleep. He would find himself back in the valley, sometimes during the excavation, sometimes earlier, watching the creatures themselves going about their lives in that lost prehistoric world. The dreams had a quality of vividness that ordinary dreams lacked, and Vernon frequently woke with the unsettling conviction that he hadn't been dreaming at all, but rather remembering, though that made no sense because these events had happened thousands of years before he was born. In one particularly disturbing dream, Vernon found himself viewing the creatures' final days. He watched as they abandoned their scattered family groups and converged on the valley, driven by some imperative he couldn't understand. He saw them dig the pits and arrange themselves within those pits in those careful spiral patterns Whitfield had documented. And he saw that they did this willingly, deliberately, with what could only be described as resignation or acceptance. They were burying themselves alive, and they did so with the calm efficiency of beings following a plan or fulfilling a purpose. But why? What could drive an entire species to mass suicide? Vernon woke from this dream with tears on his face, though he couldn't explain his emotional response. Why should he care about the deaths of creatures that had died millennia ago? Yet he did care, felt their loss with an intensity that seemed to bypass rational thought and strike directly at something deeper, more primal. December passed into January. Vernon received a letter from Professor Whitfield describing the sensation the specimens had caused in academic circles. The skulls were indeed unlike anything in the known fossil record, and their discovery was being hailed as one of the most significant paleontological finds of the decade. Whitfield had presented preliminary findings to the American Association for the Advancement of Science and had been invited to speak at institutions across the country. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd been experiencing peculiar dreams since returning to Lexington, vivid nightmares about the valley and the creatures they'd excavated, but he attributed this to stress and overwork. The letter included the remaining $250 Whitfield had promised, bringing Vernon's total payment to $500 as agreed. It also contained an offer. Would Vernon be willing to guide another expedition to the valley in spring? Whitfield wanted to conduct a more thorough excavation, properly map and document the entire site, possibly search for additional burial locations. The university was prepared to fund such an expedition generously and would pay Vernon well for his services as guide and general assistant. Vernon held that letter for several days before responding. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with the valley or those unsettling skulls. Part of him felt he'd already taken enough, disturbed something that should have remained buried. But another part, the practical frontiersman who'd spent his life wrestling survival from these unforgiving mountains, recognized that $500 was just the beginning. If he played this correctly, he could make enough money to never have to worry about hard winters or failed hunts again. He wrote back to Whitfield accepting the offer for a spring expedition. January gave way to February, and Vernon noticed changes in himself that troubled him. He'd always been comfortable with solitude, preferring his own company to the social demands of town life. But now he found isolation oppressive, as if the silence of his cabin held something lurking just beyond perception. He began making more frequent trips to Harlan Station, seeking the company of other people, even though he had little to say to them. He'd catch himself scanning tree lines and shadows, looking for movement that was never there, fighting the constant sense of being watched. Stryker had changed too. The dog had become nervous and reactive, barking at nothing, refusing to enter certain areas of the forest that he'd previously traversed without concern. Several times Vernon woke in the night to find Stryker standing at the cabin door, growling low in his throat, his attention fixed on something outside. Vernon would rise and look out, see nothing but darkness and trees, but the dog's agitation wouldn't subside for hours. In early March, Vernon received disturbing news from town. Hadley Morse, the supposed museum representative who'd tried to buy the skulls, had been found dead in a rooming house in Middlesboro, about 30 miles southwest. The circumstances were strange enough to warrant investigation by local law enforcement. Morse had apparently locked himself in his room and refused to come out for several days. Other boarders reported hearing him talking to himself, having what sounded like arguments with invisible companions. When the landlady finally forced the door open, she found Morse dead of what the doctor determined was heart failure, though the man had been young and apparently healthy. What made the story particularly unsettling was the room's condition. Morse had covered every surface with writing, using whatever he could find, pencils, charcoal, his own blood. The writing was fragmentary and largely illegible, but several phrases had been clear enough for witnesses to remember and repeat. They don't want us to know. The valley remembers, buried themselves but not gone. Markham watching from beneath. Vernon felt ice in his stomach when he heard those phrases. They echoed too closely the writing he'd found in Silas Cornett's abandoned cabin, use similar language and imagery. He asked if anyone knew what Morris had been doing in Middlesboro, why he'd been in the area at all. The answer came from Rufus Kilgore at the general store. Morse had apparently been asking around about the location of Silas Cornett's farm, trying to find the valley where Vernon had made his discovery. Had Morse found the valley? Had he excavated more skulls? Vernon had no way to know, but the timing troubled him. Morse had died in early March, which meant he'd likely been in the area and possibly exploring the valley during late February. Whatever he'd experienced there had been enough to drive him to madness and death within a matter of days or weeks. Vernon wrote to Whitfield asking if the professor had heard about Morse's death and suggesting they might want to reconsider the spring expedition. Whitfield's reply came quickly and was longer than his previous letters, filled with a nervous energy that Vernon could sense even through written words. Yes, he'd heard about Morse. Yes, it was disturbing. But Whitfield had also received other reports, other stories that suggested there was more happening than simple coincidence or mental breakdown. 2 other researchers who'd heard about the skulls and tried to investigate the site independently had experienced what Whitfield carefully termed psychological disturbances. One had abandoned his planned excavation after a single night camping in the valley, returning to civilization, claiming he'd been attacked by sounds he couldn't describe and presences he couldn't see. The other had managed to extract several small bone fragments before fleeing, and those fragments were now in Whitfield's possession at Central University. The professor had examined them and confirmed they matched the specimens Vernon had found, but he'd also noticed something strange. The bone fragments seemed to affect people who handled them. Not everyone, and not consistently, but enough cases to establish a pattern. Several students who'd worked with the specimens had reported vivid nightmares. A laboratory assistant had experienced what she described as waking visions, seeing things that weren't there, hearing whispers in empty rooms. Whitfield himself admitted his dreams had intensified since the fragments arrived, becoming so disturbing that he'd begun avoiding sleep whenever possible. The professor's letter took a turn that surprised Vernon. Whitfield wrote that he'd been researching the valley's history, trying to find any records of indigenous peoples who might have lived there or considered it significant. What he'd found was fragmentary but suggestive. Multiple native groups seemed to have avoided the valley despite its strategic location and abundant resources. Early settlers' accounts mentioned that local indigenous peoples warned against entering certain valleys in the Cumberland region, places where the ground was bad or the old ones slept. Whitfield had found references in frontier journals to mysterious disappearances of hunters and travelers who'd entered unnamed valleys and never returned. Most intriguingly, Whitfield had uncovered a passage in a memoir written by a frontier preacher in the 1820s. The preacher described being taken by indigenous guides to a valley marked with stone cairns and cloth warnings. The guides had told him through a translator that the valley was taboo because the first people were buried there, not human ancestors, but beings that had walked the earth before humans, creatures that had known things humans were not meant to know, and had chosen to bury themselves rather than share that knowledge. The preacher had dismissed this as pagan superstition, but Whitfield wondered if it represented an oral tradition, preserving genuine knowledge of the creatures whose bones Vernon had found. The letter concluded with Whitfield's decision. He wanted to proceed with the spring expedition, despite, or perhaps because of, the disturbing elements surrounding the discovery. As a man of science, he couldn't allow fear or superstition to prevent investigation of what might be the most significant paleontological find in history. He would understand if Vernon chose not to participate, but he hoped Vernon would reconsider. They'd made the discovery together, and they should see it through together. Vernon read this letter multiple times, wrestling with his decision. The money was certainly tempting. Whitfield had mentioned a payment of $1,000 for Vernon's participation in the spring excavation. But money meant nothing if you weren't alive to spend it, and Vernon couldn't shake the feeling that returning to that valley would be a mistake, possibly a fatal one. Have you ever had to choose between doing something you knew was dangerous and walking away from an opportunity that might never come again? What did you choose? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious what you would do in Vernon's situation. In the end, Vernon's decision was made for him. In late March, he received a telegram from Whitfield that was brief and cryptic. Expedition canceled. Do not return to valley. Will explain in letter. Destroy all remaining specimens. Urgent. Vernon stood in the telegraph office reading those words, his hands shaking slightly. He'd kept one skull, the first he'd excavated, as a personal memento of his discovery. It sat wrapped in canvas in a wooden box under his bed, something he occasionally took out and examined when the mood struck him. Whitfield's full letter arrived 3 days later, and what it contained was enough to make Vernon seriously consider burning the whole thing unread. But he forced himself to read it through, and the story it told was horrifying. The professor wrote that the situation at Central University had deteriorated rapidly. The specimens had been placed in a secure storage facility while Whitfield prepared them for formal study and display. But strange things had begun happening in that facility and in the surrounding buildings. Staff reported hearing sounds at night, scraping and movement from rooms that should have been empty. Objects would be found displaced in the morning, moved from where they'd been carefully positioned the evening before. Several employees had quit, claiming the building felt wrong, that they couldn't stand to work there anymore. Then the deaths had started. First, a night watchman who'd been assigned to guard the storage facility. He was found dead at his post. No obvious cause, no signs of violence, just dead, with an expression on his face that witnesses described as pure terror. The official verdict was heart failure, but the man had been 42 years old and in excellent health. Then a graduate student who'd been cataloging the specimens was found dead in his dormitory room. Same lack of obvious cause, same expression of absolute fear frozen on his features. Whitfield had ordered the specimens moved to a more secure location, but the situation only worsened. People who spent time near the skulls or handled them began experiencing what the professor carefully termed reality distortions. They would see things that weren't there, hear voices speaking in languages they didn't understand, feel presences watching them from corners and shadows. Several had to be institutionalized after experiencing complete psychotic breaks, babbling about beings that crawled up from beneath the earth, about knowledge that burned in the mind like acid, about choices that had been made in the distant past that still echoed into the present. The university administration had finally demanded that Whitfield remove the specimens from campus entirely. He'd arranged for them to be transported to a private facility, but during that transport, the wagon carrying the skulls had crashed under mysterious circumstances. The driver, a reliable man with 30 years of experience, claimed that something had caused the horses to panic, that he'd seen shapes moving alongside the wagon in the darkness, keeping pace despite the animal's terror-driven speed. The wagon had overturned, and most of the specimens had been damaged or destroyed. The driver had survived but had lost his mind, ending up in the same institution as several of the students. Whitfield wrote that he'd come to believe the creatures they'd found weren't simply extinct animals. Whatever they had been, they'd possessed knowledge or capabilities that persisted somehow, even in death, leaking out from their remains like poison from a corpse. The professor didn't claim to understand the mechanism. It violated everything he'd learned about how the natural world functioned. But he couldn't deny the pattern of deaths and madness that had followed the excavation and study of these specimens. His advice to Vernon was clear. Destroy the remaining skull. Burn it, crush it. Do whatever necessary to ensure it was completely obliterated. Do not return to the valley. Do not excavate any more remains. And most importantly, do not tell anyone else where the valley was located. Let the site return to obscurity. Let the forest reclaim it. Let whatever was buried there remain buried. Vernon sat on his cabin's porch, holding Whitfield's letter and watching the sun set behind the western ridges. He thought about the skull under his bed, the strange dreams that had plagued him for months, the sense of being watched that had become his constant companion. Part of him wanted to follow Whitfield's advice immediately, take the skull and burn it in his stove, be rid of the thing and everything it represented. But another part, a part he didn't fully understand or trust, resisted that impulse. The skull felt important somehow, like evidence of something fundamental about the world, something that shouldn't be forgotten or destroyed just because it was frightening. He went inside and retrieved the skull from its box, unwrapping the canvas and holding it in his hands. In the lamplight, the bone seemed almost to glow with a faint luminescence that Vernon told himself was just his imagination. He turned it slowly, studying the eye sockets and the peculiar structure of the jaw, and as he did, he felt something shift in his perception. For just a moment he could see them, not a memory, not a dream, but a vision or hallucination, or something for which he had no name. He saw the creatures as they had been, moving through the forest with purpose and grace, their bodies adapted perfectly for life in these ancient mountains. He saw them using tools, crude but effective, shaping stone and wood with hands that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. He saw them communicating, not with spoken language but with sounds and gestures that conveyed complex ideas and emotions, and he saw their end. He saw them gathering in the valley, driven by knowledge they'd somehow acquired, knowledge of something coming, something that their intelligence had allowed them to perceive but not prevent. They knew they were doomed, that their species had reached an evolutionary dead end, and they chose to go out on their own terms rather than face whatever was approaching. They dug their own graves and arranged themselves in patterns that had meaning, significance, purpose that Vernon couldn't quite grasp. But most disturbing was what they'd known. They'd understood something about the nature of consciousness, about how awareness persisted beyond physical death, about how knowledge and memory could be encoded into the very structure of bone and passed on to whoever disturbed those remains thousands of years later. They'd known this would happen, that eventually something else would evolve to fill the niche they were abandoning, that those newcomers would find the burial sites and excavate the bones, and in doing so would receive the inheritance the creatures had left behind, an inheritance of knowledge, an inheritance of warning. Vernon dropped the skull, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vision, or hallucination, or whatever it had been, vanished instantly, leaving him standing alone in his cabin, with a piece of ancient bone on the floor, and the certain knowledge that he'd just experienced something that should have been impossible. He'd felt what they'd felt, known what they'd known, seen what they'd seen. And what they'd known was that consciousness was far more complex and persistent than humans understood, that intelligence wasn't unique to humanity or even to physical existence, that the universe was populated by forms of awareness that existed in states and conditions that human science had no framework to comprehend. They'd also known that some knowledge was dangerous, that certain truths were destructive to minds not prepared to receive them, that awareness could be a burden as much as a gift. Vernon understood now why they'd buried themselves. They'd been trying to protect whatever came after them from inheriting knowledge that would drive the recipients mad, and they'd failed because the very act of trying to hide that knowledge had encoded it into their physical remains, created a trap that would spring on whoever was curious or greedy or foolish enough to disturb their resting place. He picked up the skull with shaking hands and carried it outside to his fire pit. He'd burn it, as Whitfield had advised, destroy it completely. But even as he made this decision, he knew it wouldn't matter. The knowledge was already inside him now, transferred through that moment of contact and vision. He could destroy the skull, but he couldn't destroy what he'd learned from it. Vernon built up his fire until it was blazing hot, then placed the skull in the center of the flames. The bone didn't burn easily. It was mineralized, turned nearly to stone by thousands of years in the earth. But Vernon was patient. He fed the fire through the night, adding wood whenever it began to die down, watching as the skull slowly blackened and cracked in the intense heat. By morning, it had been reduced to fragments and ash. Vernon scattered those remains across his property, mixing them with soil and leaf litter, ensuring they could never be gathered together again. Then he went inside and slept for the first time in days without dreaming. But the peace didn't last. Over the following weeks, Vernon noticed changes in himself that frightened him more than the dreams had. His perception seemed altered, as if he was seeing through multiple sets of eyes simultaneously. When he looked at the forest, he saw not just the present landscape, but echoes of past configurations, the mountains as they'd been centuries or millennia ago. When he listened to the wind, he heard patterns in the sound, meanings and messages that his conscious mind couldn't quite interpret, but some deeper part of his awareness understood perfectly. He tried to continue his normal life, but normalcy had become impossible. Hunting felt wrong now, because he could sense the animals' fear and pain too vividly, as if their consciousness was as accessible to him as his own thoughts. Visiting Harlan Station became intolerable, because the press of human minds, their wants and worries and petty concerns, overwhelmed him like a deafening cacophony. In April, Vernon received one final letter from Professor Whitfield. The professor wrote that he was resigning his position at Central University and retiring from academic life entirely. The events surrounding the excavation had convinced him that some areas of knowledge should remain unexplored, some questions unanswered. He'd destroyed all his notes and documentation related to the discovery, burned his photographs, and discarded his specimens. He urged Vernon once more to avoid the valley and to discourage anyone else who might show interest in the site. The letter ended with a strange confession. Whitfield wrote that he sometimes wondered if the creatures hadn't buried themselves at all, at least not in the conventional sense. Perhaps they'd found a way to transform, to transition from physical existence to something else, something that operated according to different rules and inhabited different dimensions of reality. Their physical remains were just shells, abandoned vessels, but the consciousness that had inhabited those vessels persisted in ways human science couldn't measure or detect. If that was true, Whitfield wrote, then the creatures weren't extinct at all. They'd simply evolved beyond the need for physical form. Vernon put the letter aside and walked out onto his porch. The mountains stretched before him in the late afternoon light, ridge after ridge fading into blue distance. He'd lived his entire life in these mountains, thought he'd known them completely, understood their moods and dangers and hidden places. But now he realized he'd never truly seen them at all, had only perceived the thinnest surface layer of a reality far more complex and ancient than he'd imagined. Somewhere out there, perhaps 20 miles southeast, the valley waited with its cairn markers and its mass graves. Other people would find it eventually. Vernon had no illusions about that. Curiosity and greed would draw them in, just as those qualities had drawn him. They would excavate more skulls, handle more bones, and in doing so, they would receive the inheritance the creatures had left behind, would experience the same visions, and acquire the same dangerous knowledge that Vernon now carried. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the creatures had known exactly what would happen when their remains were disturbed. Perhaps the whole thing had been deliberate, a final act not of burial, but of propagation, a way of ensuring that what they'd learned and known would survive even after their physical extinction. Vernon couldn't stop what was coming. He could only decide whether to participate or step aside. He thought about Whitfield's offer of $1,000 for the spring expedition, money that would solve his immediate financial problems and open up possibilities for a different kind of life. But he also thought about Hadley Morse dying alone in a rooming house, scrawling mad warnings on the walls with his own blood. He thought about graduate students having psychotic breaks and drivers losing their minds and night watchmen dying of terror. The money wasn't worth that. Nothing was worth that. Vernon went back inside his cabin and wrote a letter to Professor Whitfield, informing him that he would not be participating in any future expeditions to the valley. He didn't explain his reasons. The professor would understand. He sealed the letter and put it aside to mail the next time he went to town. Then he sat at his table and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of his life now that he knew what he knew, saw what he saw, understood what he understood. The mountains were beautiful in the fading light, their ridges sharp against the sky. Vernon watched them and wondered how many other valleys held similar secrets, how many other burial sites waited to be discovered, how many other extinct species had left behind knowledge encoded in bone and ash. He wondered if humanity was ready for those discoveries, or if, like him, we would learn too much and be unable to forget. The sun set behind the western peaks, and darkness came to the mountains. Vernon sat in his cabin with the lamp unlit, looking out at the night, and somewhere in the darkness he felt them watching, not threatening, not hostile, just watching, waiting to see what humanity would do with the inheritance they'd been given. And years later, Vernon would sometimes tell parts of this story to people he trusted, though he always left out the most disturbing details, the visions and the knowledge and the sense of being observed by consciousnesses that no longer needed physical form. People would listen politely and chalk it up to mountain superstition or the tall tales of an isolated man who'd spent too much time alone. But those who knew Vernon well noticed changes in him. He stopped hunting except when absolutely necessary for food. He avoided certain areas of the mountains without explanation, and on clear nights he would stand on his porch for hours, staring at the ridgelines as if watching for something, or as if he could see things in the darkness that others couldn't perceive. He never married, never left the mountains, never spoke publicly about what he'd found in that valley in 1898. The location died with him when he passed away in 1936 at the age of 75, and whatever skulls remained buried there stayed buried, their knowledge and warnings locked in mineralized bone, waiting for the next person curious or foolish enough to disturb them. Because there's always a next person, there's always someone who hears the stories, dismisses the warnings, and decides to see for themselves. And when they find what Vernon found, when they hold those skulls in their hands and feel the transfer of awareness that comes with contact, when they see the visions and acquire the knowledge, they'll understand what he understood, that we share this world with forms of consciousness we've only begun to imagine, that intelligence has risen and fallen countless times in Earth's history, and that some of those vanished intelligences left behind gifts or warnings or traps that we're only now beginning to uncover. So tell me, have you ever experienced something that made you question the nature of reality itself? Something that science couldn't quite explain? Leave your stories in the comments. I read them all, and who knows, maybe your experience will become our next story. And as always, stay curious, but stay careful. Some knowledge comes with a price, and not all discoveries should be made. Until next time, this has been The Fear Behind You